Good evening and welcome back with my conversations. Sorry I haven't been around with you for a few weeks. Had too many things on my agenda that really took a lot of time. But hopefully we're back to some of our normal conversations. Well, just let me do an immediate thing on Facebook while we're waiting. The discussion today is on Islamophobia in France, and wanted to make sure that we will actually get one second, that we'll get a conversation about what is taking place in particular in France as it relates to Islamophobia and what are the developments that are there, especially as we see considerable impact on the Muslim community in France. And this is also a preparation for our annual Islamophobia conference in Paris on December 12th and 13th, which this year is going to be done virtually online. It will be the 7th annual conference, and it will be carried out both. We will have it on a platform, but also broadcast on Facebook, the Islamophobia Studies Center Facebook page. And in here, the discussion about France is really something that has to be taken in a much longer historical understanding. It is not only a matter of contemporary issues 10, 20, or 30 years. It's actually a much longer period altogether. In the sense that France's familiarity and engagement with Islam goes all the way back to its relations with the Muslim world during the period of the Ottoman. And there is actually relations between France and the Ottoman in the 16th century, even the 15th century, 16th century. And then getting later on what came to be known as the capitulation treaties. But really it was actually diplomatic relations between the Ottoman and the French in the sense of giving French access to the Ottoman market, which at a later point, when the Ottoman entered into their state of decline and indebtedness, the French used these concessions that were given at an earlier period during the strength of the Ottoman, were utilized for the French to get a foothold in some of the territories that were ruled or governed by the Ottomans. In particular, the French began to make major inroad into Lebanon and also North Africa, culminating in the direct colonization of Algeria, also having colonized other parts of Africa as well, what we right now call the Francophone countries, and then making and ending up taking control and colonizing Lebanon in post-World War I, putting the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the agreement that was signed between the French and the British to divvy up the territories, the Ottoman territories, as it was called, the sick man of Europe. More importantly, in relations to the concept of Islamophobia, even the term itself emerges in the French context to begin with in the early part of the 20th century, the term Islamophobia, which was understood or defined at the time as feeling inimical toward Islam or an inimical feeling toward Islam as the French were engaged in their relationship with their colonial territories in the Muslim world. And I may step back a little bit to actually also speak about Napoleon's invasion of Lebanon, of Egypt, sorry, the Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1797, which for Edward Said begins the modern articulation of Orientalism, because the Napoleon and the French expedition and conquest of Egypt at the time was not only a military enterprise, but also was a scientific / academic enterprise that wanted to record Egypt like has never been recorded before, not for the benefit of the Egyptians, but for the French and later on the whole Orientalist European enterprise. And from that moment on, Edward Said, in relation to his work in his book Orientalism, ushers the whole structure of representation. And this discourse and this process of representation has not actually ended. One can read what passes as academic work, both in 19th century, 20th century, all the way up to 20th century, where the same structure of representation of the Arab and the Muslim, or quote, the Orientalist subject, but also later on to representation of the global South and the Southern Hemisphere. This structure of representation is what actually informs and shapes policy and creates a whole well-stitched mode of understanding and viewing non-Western and non-European, non-North American societies, which also begins to rationalize the policies that are implemented. In a sense, what Edward Said spoke about of latent Orientalism, and I extend to say latent Islamophobia. So the French engagement with Islam and Muslims, with the idea that Islam and Muslim is in essence something that needs to be removed from the Muslims in order for them to embrace the obvious, in terms of the French, the higher level of civilization represented by the French epistemology and the French understanding. And as we see the colonial structure in particular, for those who read the work of Frantz Fanon on the colonial subject and how the French really acted and dealt with the colonial subject, we begin to understand that France's relation, at least both from a structure of knowledge and as well as policy, is not a new phenomena that we only could reduce it to Macron, in the current Emmanuel Macron, the president, or the Marie Le Pen, which is again covers the spectrum. Macron is on the political center or center left, representing the liberal perspective of the French political landscape. And then Marie Le Pen, National Front, represents the right. So in here, the uniqueness, or at least the understanding in thinking about France's Islamophobia, is that it's not exclusively a right-wing phenomena. Rather, actually, it represents both the left and the right. And in essence, it is seeing itself and casts itself as a continuation of the colonial legacy that it actually needs to transform these Muslim communities, because they do not fit the higher civilizational values, the quote, the Western values as it's cast, in particular by the French government and the French elite and various segments of the French society. So again, the colonial period, if we could deploy the term of Islamophobia, was actually one of the highest form of Islamophobic discourses, and itself the term emerges out of the French context relative to its treatment of Muslims in the colonies, and not to even think of the Muslims in France itself, because Muslims in France actually began to arrive and be brought in by the French government to work menial jobs, blue-collar jobs in various parts of France in the late part of post-1850s into the early part of the 20th century. So the Muslims in France are not just a immigrant that just arrived the past few years, or to represent that the Muslims, in essence, to be cast as the terrorist or the ISIS or the Syrian who's attempting to undo the French society. We're speaking about Muslims that have been there over 100 years, if not 150 years in France, and yet they are not, quote, French, which if you actually listen to Marie Le Pen's point of view, you can never be French because you have to be French to the source, meaning that you have to be have a purity of blood, purity of French blood, which gets us back to the notion of biological racism and the separation of racial groups into those who have a particular pure blood versus those who don't, which means those who did not mix with racial groups, especially from the global south. The more intensification of French Islamophobic attitude actually goes around the Algerian liberation struggle, where France, through almost every Islamophobic as well as every racist, violent tactic on to try to quench and destroy the Algerian resistance to French colonization of Algeria. From torture to outright murder, kidnapping, assassination, wholesale arrest, demolition of homes, destroying water systems, aerial bombing of neighborhoods, deportation, sending into exile, as well as the legacy, the French legacy of decapitating a large number of Algerian resistance fighters. And we had the oddity where the French, in their civilized sophistication, decapitated heads of Algerian resistance fighters, even going back to the late 1800s, and transporting their heads to France to be exhibited in some of their museums and put at display. And just a few months back, the French agreed to repatriate some of the skulls of these resistance fighters that were kept by the French for over 130 years, just recently in possible late consciousness, or at least late recognition of the really the despicable nature of holding on to the skulls, and sometimes not even informing the families of where the bodies of these fighters have been kept or have been disposed of. And this is also coming on the back of the mass protests that occurred in the United States as a result of the George Floyd murder, that you have an openness, not again as a result of the French discovering consciousness, but because the global environment has been transformed by the resistance, by people protesting, by moving in the streets, by challenging the narrative. So I would say that it's despite the arrogance, despite the foot dragging, despite the complete erasure, that we are still speaking about these instances and these circumstances. More importantly, when we think about the Algerian resistance, and I'm focusing on Algeria not to exceptionalize, even though it is an exceptional case, but because in here, French relationship to Muslims and to an attempt to erase and to try to challenge the agency of Muslims in their Muslim society and environment, to try to say that you need to transform yourself in order to enter into modernity, in order to arrive at civilization as it's been defined by the French. But one can ask, maybe the French could actually reflect, have a deep reflection about this civilization that ended up killing 1.5 million Algerians, including murdering and killing Algerians protesting in Paris, in the Paris massacre of 1961, where 300 Algerians were gunned down in the streets of Paris during a protest. So again, the legacy or the relationship between the Muslims in France is color tainted, disfigured by the colonial legacy that continues to be the primary features of relations governing France's treatment and relations with Muslims in France. Now we get to the contemporary period, post 1960s and so on. Now definitely there was an increased migration to France from its ex-colonies. Part of it is that the French took with them, or at least facilitated the arrival into France of certain segments of the Campadora class, or those part of the colonial administration structure, or those who were part and parcel or saw themselves as part of the French colonial enterprise. And as the colonization period came to an end and the national movements that succeeded, some of these that were at the service of the colonizers, again, the French actually took with them segments of these societies. And as such, there was a movement coming, immigration and refugee movement coming as a result of the end of the colonial period, and especially from all these Francophone countries. Moving forward, now it is really, the French left the colonies militarily, but they never left the colonies politically, economically, socially, and even militarily, by continuing to be the go-to country to train the post-colonial political order. And as such, the creation of the Francophone countries, or that relationship where the French left, but really maintained this relationship of domination, hegemonic domination, and continued to actually often manage, or at least managed to be the dominant power over the colonies, facilitating and controlling the economy, engaging in supporting coups whenever there is a political leader in the Francophone countries that is in opposition or have different trajectory for his country, that the French were at ease in using coup d'etat, supporting segments of the military that often were trained by them in order to come and control the political order. And then the educational system in most of the, if not all of the Francophone countries, continued to be French, centering epistemologically educational system. What resulted in here is in the post-colonial order was completely constantly subject to this disruption. And the post-colonial nation state that emerged were heavily dependent on France, and in essence never left the French sphere of influence and hegemonic control. So as we enter into neoliberal economics, privatization, the mode of corruption that was facilitated as well as encouraged, what we get is a collapse in some of these post-colonial states. And the end result is another wave of migration that continues to unfold in front of us. So it's not surprising that we are seeing this massive outflow from the global South in particular. Those who were colonized by the French end up going to France as their primary destination. Those who were colonized by the British end up in British or the Commonwealth, British Commonwealth, coming to the UK. The United States is increasingly, due to also its military interventions, is the destination for the regions that it actually been intervening. So there's been an expansion or an increase in refugee immigrant populations from the post-colonial global South to France, and also accelerated with both the Iraq War, the Syria, the intervention in Syria, intervention in Iraq, the Afghan War, the war in Libya, and also the intervention in Mali and other regions. So this, again, the pipeline of immigration and refugees is directly connected to the political dynamics that exist in there. Now, let me come directly to the Muslim population in France in particular, and how the Muslim population, but also all of the immigrant populations have not actually been integrated. And I know the problematics of integration and the problematic of assimilation, but setting those problematics aside, the suburbs, if we think of Paris, the immigrants and refugees were placed in the suburbs with no really investment, no educational opportunity. They were actually are to make their economic well-being, working on the margins, continue to do menial jobs. And this is, again, these are communities that over 150 years, that you're talking about 4 or 5 generations of individuals or families. And then for those who arrived post 1960s, now we're talking about over 60 years in relations to communities in there left without any real economic opportunities, educational access. And even once those who get educational access or opportunity, then there isn't really the notion of an affirmative action or notion of really making a state policy investment is not there. So what ends up, again, is you're having the colonial global South existing in the global North or in the colonial motherland, and treated and dealt with in the same mode of interaction and treatment that the French dealt with relative to their colonial legacy and colonial past. This is not to say there isn't what you call areas of change and progress. One would not put a blanket, but in general, one has to look at the structure rather than look on the unique development here and there. The exception does not nullify the rule, and the rule that France still deals with and treats its Muslim population and its global South Francophone communities in the same way that it treated them during the colonial legacy. It sees itself as a master of this population, and more importantly, it still undertakes the process of erasing their specificity, their culture, their tradition, because that's the only way for you is to enter into their notion of what it is to be civilized, is to be French. To be French is to lose your specificity, the whole notion of égalité, liberté, fraternité, and laïcité as a form of engagement. And therefore, religion in here, when we speak about Islam, Islam is seen as a religion or a tradition that does not fit into the epistemological, self-constructed epistemology and self-constructed identity of contemporary French. And it is a legacy that continues to be inherited and continue to be reaffirmed from the colonial period to the present contemporary period. So in essence, the French never stopped being colonial in their thinking and their approach, never stopped being supremacist in terms of how they see themselves in relations to their ex-colonial subject. They never stopped actually wanting to intervene to transform these societies, even to the level of wanting to transform at the DNA level of the Muslim population, as well as African populations that come from the Francophone countries. So when we come closer to the Muslim subjects in particular, the Muslim subject, in essence, is a colonial project for the French, both intellectual establishment as well as the political elite. Transforming the Muslim subject in France is an undertaking to prove the viability as well as the veracity of the French worldview of what it is and the role of France bringing civilizations to the barbarians. So the barbarians, in a sense, maybe in the past were in the colonies, but now they are in the capital and in the heartland of the colonial motherland. So this project of intervention in the life of the Muslim population in particular also has been taken relative to the end of the Cold War, where the unsureness and the lack of a clarity of what would come after the end of the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was the arch enemy. So that also fits into not only France, but the broader discourse in Europe and the United States. So the Muslim subject is being cast as this hated other that needs to be subject to the protracted violence, protracted intervention, surveillance, and transformation in order to birth again a new European and new Western period in the contemporary world. So in 2010, we see the beginning of this process under the rubric of regulating ostentatious display of religious symbolism, and therefore the hijab is seen as part of religious display in civil society. So the law passes, And now the hijab, the Muslim woman hijab, is seen as ostentatious display of religious symbolism, and therefore it cannot be allowed in areas of civil society that are funded by the government. So jobs, you cannot come to your job with a hijab. Schools, public schools, you're not allowed to have the young girls come with a hijab. Then their mother, if the mother wants to be a chaperone for an outing, they're not allowed to do so. So that begins in 2010, followed again in 2018 with the whole campaign around the prohibition of the niqab. And as such, likewise, the niqab, any woman that is wearing the niqab in public, that she would be subject to arrest. And also that her husband or family might be actually brought in for questioning by the French authorities. So that also brings us into the hijab, the niqab, as a mechanism of regulations. And now we have Macron, who actually speak about that the Muslims are in essence for wanting to be Muslims and express their identity, not only in relations to just at home, but to actually engage in as a full co-participant in the society. Now they're being actually called that you're engaged in, quote, communitarian or separatist types of discourse, which actually who's calling who? The French government and society for the longest period of time did not want to mix with the North Africans, the Maghribis, the Arabs, the colonial subjects or the Turks in the suburbs, that these are no-go zone for us because these are really different. These are almost lesser than us. And the structure of separation was a structure of politics based on separation from a structure of knowledge, separate from structure of separation of the economy. So separatism was the structure that actually the French pursued from the first moment that they actually brought in the first colonial subject to the colonial motherland in France. But now, as a result of Muslims, in essence, are becoming assertive for their rights. Let's just be very, call it what it is, that the Muslims, in essence, are being assertive, that there is no two different types of human beings. We have the right to actually have the full spectrum of rights without having to beg for them. We are as French as anyone else. If France is, again, is a state where you have a constitution that you adhere to and a set of rules and rights, we pay our taxes, but we don't get our streets clean. We pay our taxes, we get more of the police arrests. We pay our taxes, we're not moving up in the bureaucracy. We pay our taxes, and then the state is intervening, not only in our own life, but intervening in our mosques, setting up a regulatory structure to monitor mosques and intervene, arresting individuals wanting to actually shape a particular type of a Muslim participant, in the same way that the French wanted to create a particular type of a Muslim during their colonial legacy. Again, I would recommend they go through a 12-step program of decolonizing their own attitude, their own mind, and their own policy in this sense. Now, on the back of all of this, the accusation that is given is that they are trying to stop terrorism. And again, this is not a defense of terrorism. Terrorism occurred in France. You arrest the individual that is responsible. But this whole notion that to criminalize and guilt by association, which is, again, Europe had the most horrific consequences of guilt by association, or attempting to use to target a class of people for no other reason that they were otherwise. Again, in here we're speaking about the the Holocaust and the Nazi Germany. And in essence, in here, the Muslims as a class are being held responsible and hostage by the French government for the crime of one, in this case, but also are being held responsible because they express certain political point of views that the French government sees to be unwelcome or unacceptable. And let's be very clear, the French government intervened in the Muslim world. The French government have authorized military intervention. It facilitated, even in the post-1992-94 the Algerian elections, the French actually participated and supported the Algerian civil war, for, extending support for the state military that wreaked havoc. They supported Tunisian President Ali Zain al-Abidin, extended all types of support and training and so on. So all of a sudden that the French have discovered that there is a set of principles in human rights that would apply, and that the Muslims all of a sudden, for expressing their political point of view, are beyond the pale. So let's just be very clear. It's that the Muslims who are asserting their critique of France, a critique of the war on terrorism, or what's called the war on terrorism, critique of the continued intervention in the Arab and Muslim world, and critique of the French state itself for its lack of attention to the needs of the immigrants, the refugees, the critique of actually having double standard in terms of what is considered to be free speech and what's not. And again, just ask the Palestinians in France whether they are able to critique Israel in any given way. You're actually subject to prosecution. You might not be able to give a lecture in public on if you critique Israel. So in here, state of Israel, a nation state, you are prohibited from actually critiquing it, and you actually cannot engage in PDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction. You're taken to prosecution. Lectures at universities could be stopped. Conferences will be actually unfunded by the university. And this is just for critique and state. But you ask Muslims that this is despicable cartoons and insult of the Prophet, it is to be celebrated by Mr. Macron, Emmanuel Macron, and Marine Le Pen, and the rest of them as nothing other than the exercise of free speech. So again, this double standard in there is very clear. And again, the European Human Rights Court have actually issued a ruling, which is again very important, that insulting the Prophet of Islam, it goes beyond the pale of actually having critique of Islam. Again, welcome. If you want to critique Islam, as I say, ahlan wa sahlan, let's hear the critique. Because again, if you read European writings on the perceptions of Islam and the writing of Islam for the past, from the Crusaders all the way up, I'm sorry, there's nothing new that you could offer, but welcome, come on in. And don't tell me that you correlate a critique of Saudi Arabia, immediately you label it as a critique of Islam. If you have a critique of Saudi Arabia, alhamdulillah, welcome. Stop selling them weapons. So on the one hand, Mr. Macron, Trump, or Biden, or Boris Johnson, if you put on the cloak of critique of Islam and you pull up Saudi Arabia as an example, you should just completely be quiet and just don't sign on the dotted line. We're selling billions of dollars of weapons to a country that you often use at your convenience for saying that it is represents bad understanding, or at least you point to the lack of rights in Saudi Arabia, which again, if you want to critique Saudi Arabia, welcome. It creates a nation state. How it came into existence is also can be subject to a discussion post the end of World War I and the whole dynamics that brought this country into existence. And if you're at it, if you want to critique, then also why don't you actually activate your critique of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and other countries that are participating in wreaking havoc on Yemen, causing death and destruction? with your own weapons that you sell them. Because again, United States is the #1 seller of weapons of mass destruction. France, UK, Germany, and the European countries are all lining up. So please don't try to sell us any type of ethics and morals and try to say that we're just engaging in critique of Islam. If you really want to critique, I would, as I say, ahlan wa sahlan, and I'll be more than happy you could drink coffee and listen to this critique. But to try to say that Muslims need to accept to be insulted as a condition for their inclusion in the society, this is not actually any type of free speech or free expression whatsoever. What it is, it's a basic taunting of those who are marginalized. This is what it is, it's bullying. It's a state-sanctioned bullying of a marginalized society and community. It's a minority in France, and the French government with its president and with those elite. And I would add also the Muslims that also are part of the old colonial legacy, that you trot them out to say how, yes, these people are uncivilized. In essence, we also have to recognize that there is some Uncle Toms among us, so that's nothing new. So every once in a while, you know, the French will trot somebody in there to tell us how they know how horrible these communities are because I'm one of them, is this attitude, or the native expert that is there. So this is an act of taunting using religious symbolism as a way to taunt Muslims to the exclusion of others. And I challenge, if the French is so advanced in their understanding relative to religion, show me where this discourse is acceptable to any other community, using taunting, bullying tactic, breaking the doors of their religious sites, raiding mosques, monitoring and surveilling, entrapping people in a systematic way. Now, let me a little bit on the French engagement relative to Syria. Initially, the French, again, wanted people to go to Syria because it was part of a foreign policy, point of view, or at least foreign policy objective at the time. So they did not see any opposition. So here, what you call double trap, where government foreign policy on the one hand initially actually encourages, or at least looks the other way to facilitate this, and then later on blames those individuals that it facilitated them to go to the Syria front, in the same way during the Afghan war. The United States, European countries, and the Arab world sent massive numbers of individuals to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. Bloodying the face of the Russians was far more important than anything else. So the Muslims from across the globe, including here in the United States, the CIA set up a recruitment station in New York to recruit Muslims to come and go out to Afghanistan. And if you wanted to go to Afghanistan, the plane ticket is ready, the training, the transportation to Pakistan, from Pakistan to Peshawar, you go into the training program, and then also some technical support from those on the ground, and then you're up on the front fighting the Russians. The frontline troops, body bags, Muslims were the body bags and frontline troops in the Cold War to bloody the Russians' face in the same way that the Russians bloodied the American face during Vietnam. So we were, again, the pawns in that war, and mass mobilization from across the Muslim world in order to go to the front. But as people came back, now, if you look at many of the prosecutions of entrapment, of material support, of all the things that Muslim organizations, individuals, both here and in Europe, as well as in the Muslim world, whether it's in the Gulf states, in Egypt, in Algeria, and other in countries during the 90s and the period thereafter, all of the entanglement refer back to the war in Afghanistan. And this is, again, where being a pawn involves both ways. As you go to the front and you come back, you're still a pawn in the global conflicts and strategic positioning that was taking place during the Cold War. And Muslims were, again, victims at both ends, and now they continue to be blamed for a foreign policy project that was carried out in the guise of the Cold War. And when somebody asked me about Osama bin Laden, ask who recruited, trained, provided resources, infrastructure, and all of the recruits that were brought to Afghanistan. You have the files on that. You have the names. You have the training. You have the manuals. You actually can look at the training manuals that were printed courtesy of the funding agencies that were funding this foreign policy objective. And yet the Muslims, whether living in Paris, working in a cafe, or washing dishes in a restaurant, or cleaning the streets, or doing any type of work, or the Muslims here in the US, whether being a lawyer, doctor, or owning a restaurant, or a kebab place, or a taxi driver, or a Somali business person, or a congressman, they have to answer for foreign policy decisions and strategies that they have nothing to do with them, and now they have to answer. And then you send all these entrapment tactics to try to actually entrap them anew, because it rationalized the current funding priorities of a surveillance state, of a security state, where you have fear is monetized and Islamophobia is monetized in that way, in order to actually make people scared from each other, scared from their neighbor. And the Muslim, again, is the monster Inc. of these days. All what you need to do is Muslim and terrorism, and now everybody just suspend their intellect. They rationalize the most horrific policies to be undertaken, and Macron is going down that same track, which he has been at, which France has been at it for quite some time, similarly to the UK and the United States as well, is Islamophobia. Lastly, let me say the following, that some Arab countries are also co-participant at this point, because they have a benefit, especially those autocratic, despotic dictators, as well as monarchs, because one way to continue to consolidate the seats of power that they're sitting is to continue stoke that there is the threat that we are facing. And as such, these ruling elites, as well as the despots who just rotate, again, playing musical chairs among these families, they have no interest in actually having any type of participatory political order. They are not really interested in the transformation of their society on the basis of empowerment. There is no thinking of actually collective effort to uplift the society. And don't tell me that you have this project and this project. Money, you could buy a lot of stuff, but you cannot buy a society that is self-confident, that transforms not only itself, but the world as it goes around. So again, if the clear example is many of the thinkers, intellectuals, scholars are actually leaving the Arab and Muslim world in droves because you're not allowed to think, you're not permitted to have actually free thought. You are unable to move up. You have no opportunities in the same way that you have. In essence, we have a locked political system, and all is this supported by the French, the British, the Americans, on they sell weapons to these dictators, and then they blame us for being actually despotic in our epistemology and our worldview. So again, these are the contradictions that we are living, and Mr. Macron is trying to give us some lessons both about Islam, Muslim, and what it is to be liberal and so on. And the only thing I would say, if you think so much about these notions, why don't you actualize them in practice relative to both your domestic policy and your foreign policy for the most part? And again, I will actually continue to critique and provide the critique to what is taking place, because Islamophobia now is the camel that they all are riding into seats of powers and parliament. So whenever you have a problem, just bring your Islamophobic camel and ride it, and that's it. You're no longer responsible for whatever domestic or foreign policy disaster that you have reaped over the past while you're having on seats of power. So please join us for our 7th annual conference on Paris Islamophobia conference on December 12th and 13th. And we will make sure to put the announcement on Facebook and promote it. I look forward to having continued discussion with you on this important subject. Assalamu alaikum.